Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Jay Barbanel. Looking forward to our conversation, Jay. It's been a while, mate.
Simon.
We like 3, 4 months, was it? Before Christmas? Was it
Yeah, it
before
was
Christmas?
before Christmas that we first met and
Yeah,
started planning this episode. So I'm happy
yeah,
to be
yeah,
here.
yeah. Cool. So, we are recording this in March, but it'll be released, listeners, in April. Fingers crossed, because it's going to coincide with Jay's book, which is called Finding Tico. So we might get into a little bit that later on. But the big question, Jay, is what does thriving mean to you?
Um, I think thriving is there's a lot of different sectors of thriving. I think there's the internal thriving, which is something that I've been focusing on for so long, and I mean, really for the last 3 years. Um, and then there's the outside thriving, and then there's thriving with others.
Yeah,
So I think those are my three. When I think of it, that's those are three things that first pop up in my mind.
yeah.
Um,
3 years is it's labor for us, right? We're doing the work. We're
Yes, it's
we're
it's
doing the
labor
work.
and it's not easy, you know. It takes a lot of dedication, and I think that for me specifically was through therapy. And what I learned the most from it was that it's not the 50 minutes in the session that will do the work. I think it's the work that you do outside of those sessions with what you learned and how you apply it, and that's how you begin to really thrive.
Yeah. And just in case there's any adoptive parents listening out there, we we're diving into to Jay's insights as an adoptee here. But the one thing that I hear from adoptive parents in terms of what they need to do to help their kids thrive is for them to do their work too. Right?
Mhm.
For we all benefit from unpacking our own emotional baggage, to
Right.
quote an adoptive mum that I interviewed a few years ago. So yeah,
But to,
so
to that point, though,
yeah,
Simon, I just want to jump in. To that point, I think that it's important to also understand that you have to be ready to do that, to do the work. Um, I was presented to do the work when I was a kid, and I was completely against it. And it wasn't until later on in life that I was ready to do it, and that's when it started to really work.
yeah. So what changed then? Have you got an insight into what changed over the time? What was there anything particular that prompted your readiness? There was something that laid the ground rules. Sorry, not the ground rules. Laid the ground for diving into the work.
There was, I mean, I think that something that I didn't know that I struggled with a lot in my life was relationships, and not in terms of relationships with others, but just intimate relationships with partners. And I was actually in, it was in through the process of getting a divorce that I sat down and I kind of really asked myself, like, what is going on here and why didn't it work? And that's when I really understood that I had to go back to understand why I wasn't able to really connect on those levels. And that's really what prompted me to go back into therapy and do the work to understand myself
Yeah,
before I could kind of give myself to someone else.
yeah. You touched on something just a couple of minutes back about not seeing it,
Mhm.
seeing something for the new time, seeing something for the first time. And one of the quotes that comes back to me time and time again is a young quote, and it goes something like this: until we make the subconscious conscious, it will rule our life, and we will call it fate.
Yes, 100%.
100%. Or in two simpler words, right? Our 3 words, our blind spots, right?
Right,
Our
right.
blind spots. We can't see them.
Yeah,
That's the issue.
it's so funny because I look back at myself, 3 years ago, and it's almost like it's unrecognizable because I thought that where I was, it was just I feel like I was so it was so normal to be frozen. And once I kind of snapped out of that, then that's when perspectives and really myself and my entire um, everything changed so deeply for me because I didn't realize that I had kind of compartmentalized so many things from the past to protect myself, you know? And once I understood that and really opened it up, things changed dramatically, and it changed very quickly too.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, there's so much there. What, when you said it's normal to be frozen, what what do you mean by that, Jay?
Um, I think the best way I can describe that is I'll tell you a story, a quick story. So, I was driving to
We've got an
work
hour here,
and
mate, so just take your time, mate. No
yeah.
rush.
Well, this one won't take an hour, but
Okay.
so I'm driving to work, and this is a couple years ago now. Excuse me. And I felt it was morning, I was driving downtown LA, and it was just I just felt light, really light, and I was really happy. And I kind of sat there and I asked myself, I was like, why? Why are you so happy right now? And I realized that it was for no reason whatsoever. It was just like a really light feeling. And that's when I realized that was the first time really in my life that I felt truly, truly happy for no reason at all. And it made me realize that the past I hadn't been living with that. And when I say frozen, it was the lack of that just pure joy. Um, and that was just normal to me. I didn't know that there was this other option of being completely, satisfied with myself.
Yeah. And did this moment of lightness did that come to you whilst you were going through the therapy stuff, or before then, or
Yeah, it was definitely it was the day after like a really, really positive session that I had with my therapist. We had kind of gone through like a really good breakthrough where I started to understand things. And the next day I felt that lightness. And it's almost like, because I was able to get that out, it kind of carried over. Now, that lightness it can't be every day, and I understand that. But when I do feel that, I always take the second to acknowledge it
yeah.
and remember.
Uh, I've s- I've got a question on my coming to my mind, Jay, and it sounds a little bit, I don't know, coachy or therapist-y, and I'm none of those things right now, but I felt that lightness. What if that's who we are?
I think that is. I really think that is deep down who we truly are. And when that shines, I think that it's like it feels inside, it feels like the most beautiful thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's for no reason at all, which is
It's
like,
for no reason at all. Yeah,
yeah. And you compare that to the past and you realize that it's just such polar opposites.
yeah. So what veils it?
I think that Um, for me, what veiled it was basically just I didn't allow myself to bring that out. I was trying to protect myself, and I think that that feeling is so vulnerable and so empathetic,
Yeah,
and I didn't want to bring that out because of the things I had been through. It was easier for me to kind of have that wall up and to be hard than to be light and empathetic. Because if you're light and empathetic, then I think that allows people to come in. And for my case, like I was to allow someone to come in means I have to explain everything I had been through, and I couldn't do that.
wow. Yeah, phew. Yeah. Did you do you know the modality or the approach your therapist was taking?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been very, very conversational.
Yeah,
And then the thing that the reason why it really clicked for me working with him was because it never felt preachy or it never felt like lessons. It just felt like discovery.
yeah.
And it was just through common conversation that we began to dig deeper. And then I think he just guided me into going and keep on digging and digging and digging
Yeah.
until I was like, okay, I can talk about this.
Well, the reason behind my question about the modality is because you use the word protector. So there, what the protector parts are it's a term used. I'm sure it's a term used in lots of different techniques or modalities. You know, like
Mm,
approaches to therapy. But
sure.
there's one called there's one called internal family systems, IFS, and by a guy called the founder of it's a guy called Richard Schwartz, and he talks about protector parts, and the protector parts are our well, that's what they do. That's why he calls them that. Um, he's really to distill what he's talking about down. He 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 talks about the uppercase S self, right? And what he means by that is that light space that we are,
Yeah.
that lightness. So if that lightness was a thing, yeah,
Right.
um, the uppercase S self is the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's two words. It's the synonyms. Two words for the same thing, right? So
Absolutely.
essentially, he says that that the best metaphor I've got for this will only work if
Mhm.
you know what I'm talking about. Have you ever played Trivial Pursuit?
It's been years since years since I played Trivial Pursuit, but
Yeah.
yes, I have.
Okay. So you know you get a cheese holder. You get this round.
Uh-huh.
You get the round disc. Yeah.
Yep.
You get the round disc with the spaces for the cheeses. Yeah.
Yep.
So the cheese holder is the uppercase S
Hmm.
self, and that's who we truly are, right?
Yes.
And the cheese holder is empty.
Hmm.
The trauma is in the cheeses. The trauma is in the parts.
Yes. Totally.
Oh, and one of the cheeses is the protector part.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's a great way of putting it. Yeah. I think that for me personally, like I didn't have that part for such a long time.
Um,
Or I
you,
didn't
you,
have the holder for such a long time, I think.
yeah,
You know?
yeah. You talked about discovery and digging.
Hmm.
What was that? It sounds like to me like the therapist, like he's prompting insights in you. Is that like you
Yeah,
saw
well, I
new
mean, the
things,
thing
or what was it?
the thing is that, and I guess I have to explain a little bit further, like when I went to therapy, it really wasn't about my adoption. Um, it was more about the separation with my brother and I, you know? And that's something that I'd hid so deep because it was so painful. And so what my therapist was able to do was just s- give me little perspectives of how to see the situation in itself that then opened up so many other things. For example, like, you know, when my brother left, I just hit it so, like I said, hit it so deep. And then the first thing that the first perspective he gave me, he was like, look, what if we present this almost as a death, right? Hit the separation, present it almost as a death. And he said to me, like, he goes, what do you do after somebody that you love dies? Obviously there's a funeral, there's the mourning period, there's, all of that that comes with it. And he said that, Jay, you never did that, right? Because you just hid it away and said, I'm not going to ever deal with this again. And so the digging was, I think, starting to understand that and then being able to grieve it. And, that happened almost 30 years ago. And so to grieve something, 30 years later is an experience that's very bizarre. But I think when I decided to open up and really accept and surrender to that idea, that's when the digging kind of really got deeper and deeper and that lightness started to appear. And once I saw that lightness, that's when I started almost chasing it, because I loved that feeling.
Yeah,
And I think it's like I love the feeling of finding myself through that.
yeah. Well, that goes with the discovery That's what you mean by
Yeah,
the discovery. So you
that's what I
did
mean
the
when I
digging.
yeah,
You did the
yeah,
digging. You did the digging through the grief,
yeah,
which you hadn't dug through before,
right.
and that revealed this lightness for you,
Yes,
and
for sure.
the therapist has been there,
Right.
helping
And
you dig.
right. And then things that like, through that, through the digging of that process, that kind of went full circle because that brought me to um being more curious about my adoption and my origin story. And then through starting to discover that, that's what ended up bringing me home back to my country and connecting with my sister. And so it's just this cycle that all kind of happened in the weirdest way, but it was very organic. And my therapist really like helped me guide through that.
Yeah. You talked about compartmentalizing before.
Yes.
What was what were you compart? Was it the grief you were compartmentalizing, or
I mean, it was definitely the yeah, it was I think part of it was the grief. But I also just compartmentalized the entire experience. And it wasn't one of the main things was even when I was, this happened when I was 7 years old. And I remember when my brother left, I talked to my parents and I said to them, let's take all the pictures out of the house with my brother in them. Let's never talk about this ever again, right? Because my way of survival really was to just put that in a box and never open it again and basically convince myself that I was fine, right? And I think that's where the beginning of that frozen feeling really started because I think prior to that I had so much empathy and so much love, but that part really hardened me, you
yeah?
know.
What do you mean by left? He left. Your brother left.
So we got adopted together.
Yeah,
And then when I was 7 and he was 9, some pretty traumatic things happened in the house, which ended up sending him back to Costa Rica, where we're from. And then I stayed with my family and he went back to
yeah,
our country.
yeah. Wow. And is he still around, your brother?
Yeah, I mean, we ended up connecting in 2015. So it was almost 2 decades after we last saw each other. But then about a year ago, I made the decision that it was the healthiest thing for me to do was to walk away because it was a really toxic relationship that I kind of chased for a long time until I realized that it was never going to change. So I kind of had to make the decision to walk away, which was not easy, but I understand that it was for my own well-being and for my own, like really for my own self-love.
Yeah. So that happened. That was happening whilst you were in the therapy. Then, if it was 2 years ago, yeah, you've done therapy for the last 3 years. Yeah,
Yeah, so we reconnected like in 2015 and then I tried to I almost convinced myself that the relationship was going to change, you know. I always wanted my brother to be something that he couldn't be, and I was always willing to try to get there.
yeah,
But then like through the therapy, yeah, I realized that that was never going to happen. Um because of some things that happened while I was kind of doing my search for my family.
yeah.
And obviously I talk about all of this in my book,
In the
but
book, yeah,
um, you know, yeah, it was during that period. But I think that prior to therapy, I never would have had that strength or even the knowledge to know that I was doing this for myself rather than
yeah,
anybody else. And this I mean separating myself from him.
yeah. It would have been a blind spot, right? It would have been a
Yeah.
blind spot. Yeah,
Yeah, because he basically was he really tormented me for most of my life, and because he was my brother and because I loved him, I always just said, "Oh, that's not too bad." Um, but then once it clicked, I was like, "That is actually really bad." That's my the therapy allowed me to understand all
yeah.
that.
My guessing is that he hasn't done the therapy.
No, no, he is not. I hope one day he does, but I don't know if that's ever in his cards.
Yeah, yeah. So, what's happening for you? What's happening for you now? Where are you? You've clearly you've written the book. Tell us about that process and and what that's brought you doing writing the book.
Yeah, it was it was a very interesting process because I've always loved to write and I'm a big reader. But it was one of those things where I would write, but I could never read back my writing. I always hated reading back my writing, so I wouldn't write. And then my therapist, he presented obviously in therapy, journaling is a big part of that. And so he got me the idea. He's like, look, start doing your journaling. And I was like, all right, cool. And he said, and I told him about how I hate reading everything back. So he said, look, just write freely, rip it up and call it a day. But at least you're writing and getting it on paper. And so I did that for several months years ago. Um, and then that kind of I started being able to read my writing back. And because of the narrative of the story, I've been told by family members, for years, oh, you should write a book about this. And then I finally decided, I was like, all right, let me just try. And so I started writing. But the thing is that I didn't know so much of the information that ultimately comes in the book. And so it was almost like I was a journalist in my own life, and the book allowed me to chase that, which was really interesting. Um, and it was hard, it was really hard. There were periods where I would go like 5 weeks without writing because the memories and the things I was writing about were so intense and so hard that I had to walk away for a second. And then when I was ready, I'd go back and continue. One thing that I made some rules for myself, like you have to always be sober when you're writing, be completely honest when you're writing. Um, Even if it feels uncomfortable, just push through it and you can edit it back later. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah,
So yeah, it was quite the process and it took, I think I had like 9 drafts of this book, um, that I kind of started from scratch and wrote the whole thing again. Um, because I really wanted to be as raw and vulnerable as I possibly could make it.
yeah. Did you? You said that you didn't. You used to not like reading what you'd written. Is that because it was too painful, or it was too emotional, or you just didn't like the story of the past? What have you got
I
a
think
clue
it
for that?
was. I think it's an interesting question. I think that maybe it was even just seeing a version of myself, that vulnerable version of myself, was so unfamiliar to me, And when I was writing, I think I was getting those vulnerable parts out, and yeah, it was like
Yeah.
reading something from someone that I didn't recognize.
So maybe it was the protector part of you didn't want you to read. The vulnerable guy wanted to write, and the
Right.
protector didn't didn't want you to write.
100%. Yeah.
So you kind of
Totally.
like
And
fighting against. Yeah,
yeah, it was
I'm
kind of like this
laughing.
internal
Sorry, it's
battle.
just like it
No,
does
no,
seem
no,
nuts,
but
doesn't it? Internal civil
yeah,
war, right?
yeah, that's the best way to put it. It was like this internal battle that I was in, right? And the thing is that I didn't understand so much of the story anyway. I think deep down inside, I probably had a pretty good feeling, but I didn't know what was going on.
Yeah, yeah. Are you still seeing the therapist?
I am. Yep.
Yeah,
I see him
that might be an
every
interesting.
week
That might be an interesting thing
Yeah,
to to dig into, right?
for sure.
I I had I I had a realization off the back of I use ChatGPT a lot as a thought partner. I think I heard this word, um, but it just helps me. You've got uh, you've got some colleagues in the agency that you work in. I'm just a solo socialpreneur or whatever I am. Um, so I bounce ideas off ChatGPT, and I I asked it, why am I beating myself up? Basically, it doesn't need any more detail than that. And it said, so because the protector part, perhaps, right? The protector part thinks that if it screams loud enough,
Hmm.
you'll stop it. You'll stop
Yes, for
this
sure.
uh, whatever I was doing. And I thought, oh wow, I never I'd never seen it. I'd never seen it like that. And that it, something pretty cool from that insight because I didn't know why.
Right.
What like uh, when you've got something intellectually, but that doesn't do it, right? That doesn't
Hmm.
stop it. That doesn't solve the issue. That doesn't stop you doing it.
Right.
Then you've got to dig a little bit deeper. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
and
So
it's fun. It's funny because like on that protective part, like it's not always the internal dialogue that it shows up. It shows up sometimes silently just through the way that your body feels.
yeah,
And I think that kind of acknowledging how for you specifically that protective part appears, and being able to be like, no, like we don't
yeah,
need that.
no,
That's something that I really learned. That was pretty interesting. And then I talk about a lot. What I call it the voice of trauma, right? And it's this dialogue that you have mentally with yourself, but also just with your body.
yeah. Um, I was I was going to ask you about that, and that was what was behind my question about. You said it's normal to be frozen, and I
Hmm.
kind of as I was listening to you, I underlined the word frozen,
Hmm.
and frozen is a body thing, not an inner critic thing, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I would say I suppose.
Okay.
No,
Uh,
and I say that because, yes, I think that there is the physical sensation of being frozen, but I think that, I remember times in the past where I would be completely frozen. And even my mind, like I couldn't like even decipher what was going on internally. And I was just like everything was so scrambled that it was like almost thinking was hard,
yeah,
you know?
but freezing is a trauma response, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Um,
it is.
when because when you said frozen, I thought, and we were talking about we'd be talking about relationships. Um, the thing that popped into my head is I wasn't very good with, and I'm still not actually with skin on skin contact,
Hmm.
and I'm presuming that that's some sort of
Sure.
somatic somatic implication, some somatic residue, right? So,
Hmm.
and I wasn't aware of it until something. It was in the early 90s. Uh, the girls at work, one of those girls I went on to marry, but one of them touched me at the back on the back of the neck, and I was stiff.
Hmm.
I froze. I was like, wasn't, and they were like, what's going on? And other people on my wife's family have said to me, though, you didn't used to be a hugger, Simon. It
Hmm.
was the contact thing wasn't my space. Um, so at the top of the conversation, we talked about you talked about three sectors for thriving: internal,
Hmm.
others, and outside. We've gone pretty deep on the internal stuff.
Yeah.
Uh, what's been changing for you on the relationships side,
Um,
or ideas, or take that as broad as you like, James.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of like the relationships, that changed drastically once I became lighter. And that, it was with my family, with my friends, with the people that I work with. I think that as I became more empathetic and more light and more myself, that started to shine with others, and they started to feel that, and it allowed, I just feel like my connections, I guess, became a lot deeper because I wasn't I didn't have that wall up and I wasn't pushing away.
Yeah,
I was able to completely like allow people in, um and it just strengthened the relationship so much. I mean, even in the conversations I was having became so much deeper. The way I listened became a lot deeper, because there was more. I think I just cared. I really started to care more about the people around me, because I really started to care about myself.
yeah. Open is the word that pops into my head. I mean,
Mhm.
you said wall, right? So
Yeah,
the wall came tumbling down, right?
yeah. I
And
mean, I think that similar to kind of your um, sensation of touch, right? I think mine was more like just my inability to allow people in, because I always thought that if I allowed someone in, and give them the most vulnerable part of myself, then they have the ability to leave, right? Because I was so used to people in my life leaving. And once I understood that the people that are around me that love me and that I love aren't going to do that to
yeah,
me, that's when my relationships with them started to really evolve and change.
yeah. So perhaps the slight difference between, or not slight difference, but the difference between what we're, what I'm, t I was talking about physical stuff. You're talking more about, I guess,
Mhm.
conversational stuff rather than physical stuff. Um, what was the wall, do you think?
It was just the wall. I mean, the wall really came from the idea of, the fear of abandonment, really. When I looked at it now, I understand it now, but in the past, when I looked about my adoption, I never thought about my biological mother leaving. It was something that I was just kind of like, all right, well, that I was so young and so small when that happened, whatever. Then when my brother left, that was like the big hit. And so the wall, I was just so afraid of letting people in fear that they would just eventually leave.
So it's protection. Well, it's back to the protection thing, really. It's like a protection mechanism to not letting people
Yeah,
in
it's
unless
yeah,
they.
it's just a total shield that you put up for yourself, for your survival, and for your own well-being. But with others, once I was able to bring that shield down, then it completely changed, those relationships.
Yeah,
With my even I mean my I remember when my folks and I went out to dinner one day, and this was maybe 6 months into my therapy, and I really started to kind of shed those walls. And we sat there for like 3 hours and had the best time. And it was like we've always had a great relationship, but at that moment specifically, it was like everything was just like everything. There was just such a drastic change that everybody noticed it. And I didn't even realize that I maybe had that wall up with them even. Who were like the closest people that I have.
yeah, yeah. You mentioned your sister.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Of course, yeah. So, through this process of therapy, I I found out a lot about my origin story. And so I was going through the motions of trying to reconnect and reunite with my biological family. I use social media quite a bit, or actually, I use social media for all of it. And when I was just about to give up my search because I didn't really, what I had found was all negative and really painful. I basically said maybe I'm not meant to go back into that world. Maybe I'm doing myself a disjustice. Maybe I was taken out for a reason. So completely stopped searching. And then like 2 weeks later, this woman reached out to me and she's like, "Hey, I saw like your post on Facebook and I think we're related." And I was like, this is weird. Usually I'm the one sending those messages. And so we connected, and we instantly, I realized that she was looking for what I was looking for. Because she also never had that. She basically has been by herself since she was 15 years old in Costa Rica. And we sat down and we talked, and I gave her all the information that I had. She gave me a little bit of information she had, and then we decided to continue the relationship. And then we talked for like 6 months every single day, and really
Wow.
connected. And then she was just like, "Hey, would you ever want to come down to Costa Rica and visit?" Which was like my biggest fear because I hadn't been back since I was 3 when I was adopted.
Yeah.
And so I thought about it really hard and I was like, you know what, maybe this is the time. And so last October I went down there and I spent the week with her and her 2 kids and her boyfriend. And it was, I think the most beautiful experience that I've ever had in my life, was connecting with her. And still to this day, it'll be a year on April 28th, the day the book is released, that we connected. And we've spoken every single day since then and have just like nurtured this beautiful, beautiful relationship.
Yeah.
It's like I lost my sibling when I was 7, and I never thought I would get that feeling back. And then just through this whole experience, I found that again, but in the most positive of ways.
Yeah. And what's the feeling, Jay?
Um, it's just like the deepest, rawest feeling of just love, you know? Um, it's like that unconditional love that people talk about. I like really, really have that now. And I think that like I went from kind of protecting myself so much to committing to protecting her by all means.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the most special, I think the most special relationship that I really have, because it's something that I've just always wanted my entire life.
Yeah. That feels like the right place to bring it in, Jay.
What's that?
That feels like the right place to bring it in.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, listeners. And thanks, Jay. We'll speak to you again very soon. Take care.